We are back on Inside Politics. Today our guest is Metro's official historian Carole Bucy and Metro Councilman Freddie O'Connell. We're talking about 2nd Avenue. Both of you sort of talked about this a little bit. Mayor Richard Fulton back in the late 1970s, early 80s joined with Historic Nashville and other groups to begin the annual Market Street Festival held every fall down there. A lot of people didn't, Carole, think people would show up for that, but they had a lot of people come down. Was that perhaps one of the big turning points that people realized they would come back downtown to Nashville and they would come back to 2nd Avenue?
I think the Market Street Festival was a huge success and a major turning point. As early as 1971, there had been an effort to preserve those buildings by preparing a National Register of Historic Places nomination for it, to put it under some historical coverage. And it was granted, as I understand it, in 1972. And so the preservation movement in Nashville really began at that point in the very early 70s. And then by the time the Market Street Festival came along, the preservationists were really well organized through Historic Nashville, Inc., and able to save a lot of things. Certainly there have been some major losses, but we could have lost the Ryman Auditorium. There's a lot of things that we could have lost here had it not been for determined preservationists. And one of the people that really needs to be credited with all of the resurrection of preservation here is Fletch Coke. If you talk to Ridley Wills, he will talk about the buildings that should have been here but got destroyed before 1900. And so we really do owe Fletch and the team that she put together a great debt for organizing people and making them aware. You know, people don't ever think, you walk down a street so many times, you don't ever think about, well, gee, that's one of the oldest buildings in town.
You know, Freddie, you mentioned going to the spaghetti factory. That was one of the first restaurants that went back down there. And part of that rebirth there, I think, probably was because of the federal tax incentives that were done in those days to allow those buildings to be redone. There were offices done down there, restaurants, and even the beginning of downtown living. That seemed to be one of the real things that made a difference. Freddie, I think as the Metro Councilman, you're looking at ways that government might help again to do something about that, and that might include some taxes. What idea have you got something about in lieu of taxes?
Yeah, so Pat, it's been a real challenge because, you know, as you know, that area is now fully a mixed use area, right? We had dozens of businesses, but also hundreds of residents impacted by the bombing, even though the number of fatalities, thankfully, was none other than the suspect. We still had a lot of damage and a lot of people lost their homes. And so this all happened at the end of a year where we had already seen the local economy just constrained by the public health and economic crises of COVID-19, and how not just Nashville, but cities and counties around the world have had to respond to that. So it's difficult to kind of navigate what we have the authority to do. But one of the things that we have done in various circumstances to provide relief or to offer affordable housing as a program called payment in lieu of taxes model, right? And there, what you effectively do is, usually the way it works is you work with one property owner or one project team and kind of say, all right, for this one project, we're going to give you a sort of a temporary tax abatement, and we're going to kind of, you know, hold the property for you and allow you to pay something less than what the prevailing property tax rate is. Here, the complicating. Oh, go ahead.
What kind of response are you getting about it? Have you bounced that off Mayor Cooper? Have you bounced that off your fellow council members? And what about particularly the property owners down on 2nd Avenue?
Yeah, so I will say one of the reasons I've been pursuing this is because the property owners were looking at just this most recent February tax deadline, and they were saying, you know, look, the ways that we have historically generated income from these properties, or in some cases, our home just is not available right now. How can we possibly pay a full tax rate for the next several years? And so there's just a tremendous amount of interest from the property owners, residents, and business operators. And the mayor's office, I think, is curious. They're willing to participate so far. I think they're looking for details. And Pat, the complicating factor here is, usually that is one major property owner that this works with, or a small number.
Would you do the whole street? Would you do the whole street, or just the part of the street that was impacted, just the property owners that were impacted by the bomb? Because the lower part of the street was not impacted.
We're probably looking most intensely at the area that's been called sort of the red zone from Church Street to Commerce Street, where the extent of the damage was the greatest. I'm still looking at boundaries, but the complicating factor here is just the sheer number of property owners. Some of those buildings are condoed out, which means there's not even a single owner for a single building, and we'd have to negotiate agreements with anybody who wanted to participate.
And I suspect the problem is even more difficult because you're in a property tax property reappraisal throughout the county, and that, because of the growth that's gone on there in the years before the bombing, those properties are likely to be more valued and more valuable, and therefore their taxes might well go up because of the reappraisal, and that sort of complicates matters, doesn't it?
Right, but for the bombing, I think 2nd Avenue, there was already a lot of examination of this corridor to look at, hey, how could we improve this to make this stretch of downtown, from Broadway to Public Square, as interesting to visitors as Broadway had become. And so, you see glimmers of that in the new decorative tree lighting that just got switched on a few weeks ago.
Let me ask a question for both of you. A lot of groups in town, including here at NewsChannel 5, are helping to raise money for those who are severely impacted. It's sort of the way we do things in Nashville, whether it's the 2010 flood or the tornadoes from last year. It's almost gratifying to live in a city where people will step up and try to help people in times of need. And this is definitely one of those times of need, isn't it, Carole?
Oh, it is. And I think that's one thing that Nashville has always been very well known for, is reaching out and helping anybody. We've had tornadoes, we've had floods, we've had ice storms, we've had fires, and yet we see that Nashvillians have come together to solve problems of that nature and to try to help other human beings, which you don't see in other cities where it's sort of me for myself.
Carole Bucy, Metro's official historian, and Freddie O'Connell, Metro Council member, our guest on Inside Politics. We're talking about what's happened on 2nd Avenue and what the rebirth there might be, starting as quickly as possible. Back to more conversation after this break.